Okay, let's make a start so we don't get too late. Welcome to this Regen webinar session, which is all about the decarbonisation of heat, which is, I think, generally agreed to be the biggest challenge in the decarbonisation of the energy sector, our net zero challenges. Probably almost kind of cliche to say that, you know, heat's very hard, that's the big challenge, but probably it's tended to stay in the too difficult box in terms of actually tackling that. We're all waiting on the next sort of heat strategy out of government, perhaps later this year. But in that context, Regen, and sort of the base of this event today is Regen's produced a paper on the decarbonisation of heat. There it is. Nice flame on the front of it. And I think all of you have had that in your inbox. Is that right? I'm looking at Rachel, who's our producer today, clicking away on the webinar software here. So this was going to be an event. Traditionally, when Regen writes a paper, we get everyone together in London or wherever and have a kind of live discussion. So apologies to those of you who are expecting to sort of be with us in person at TL's offices in central London for obvious reasons, and taking account of the concerns of the venue in particular, we decided to switch to a webinar format. So I guess all of us are going to have to get a little bit more used to webinars in the months ahead, and video conferencing and the like. So this is not quite our first webinar, but our first sort of major one of this type. So perhaps bear with us if the technology doesn't work seamlessly. We've got 5 or 6 participants in different locations. So some of them hopefully we'll be able to see their faces, some of them perhaps only audio, but the format we're going to run with is essentially a discussion type format. So the agenda and the running order essentially is we're going to talk through the paper. We're going to hear from Liz Kitchen, who is in the Whitehall studio, somewhere in the bowels of Bays, no doubt, who's going to talk through his lead on heat policy, heat strategy policy at Bays. And then we've got Johnny and Mark, the report authors here in the Regen office. So this is extra cooling, if you like. And then we also have some comments and a panelist from Chris Clark, who we should thank at this point for his support of the paper that we're discussing today. Chris Clark from Wales and West Utilities. We've got Nathan Wyatt from the National Infrastructure Commission, that's been very active in thinking about future energy policy and energy infrastructure in particular. Tim German at the Energy System Catapult, who've been on the Today programme this morning, so lots to say. Maxine Frerk, who is Grid Edge Policy and a former leading light at Ofgem. So those are the participants, at least hopefully, if we can get all the technology to work. So what we're going to do, Rich, are we able to access Liz at the moment?
So I can unmute everyone, or I can't just unmute Liz at the moment.
Okay, so
yeah, she's having technical issues because they've got a lockdown commuted.
Okay, so what we're going to do while we're okay, so we're going to start by asking Liz from Bays to set a little bit of scene. So before we get into the paper and what we've said, we thought it'd be helpful to hear from government, from Department of Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, who are working on a heat strategy, and to get a little bit of context from them as to what they see are the big challenges, where they see kind of heat policy going, what are the big issues they're going to be thinking about in the next 9 months or so, as they tackle what I think all of us would agree is a big challenge, perhaps be a big challenge for any civil service to be given the topic of decarbonising heat and asked to go away and sort that out. So on that note, Liz, can you hear us?
I can. Can you hear me?
Excellent. Yeah, you're coming across loud and clear. Okay, Liz, we'll hand over to you, and if you just want to kind of give us a bit of an intro into Bayes' thinking on the decarbonisation of heat.
Thank you so much. What I'll do is I'll aim to keep this quite short because I know you can't see me and I think it's quite hard to listen to a faceless voice talk for very long. So I'd just like to thank you for the report, which I have read. I think it's really interesting. I think it's a great account of where we are now and has some quite interesting thoughts about what the way forward might be. You've said a couple of times that this is a huge challenge, and maybe that is a cliche. My own kind of personal journey into this space, I came fresh off the back of doing the strategy and tactics for the Paris Agreement, and I thought I would quite fancy a job that was, focused on domestic policy, maybe something a little simpler than trying to get 198 countries to agree. And I've certainly found myself working on something that I think is a lot more complex, a lot more of a sprawling issue. And instead of trying to think about the needs and the interests of 198 different states, I'm much more in the space of trying to think about 30 million different consumers, both private consumers, businesses, industry. So yeah, this is certainly, it's a big job and there's a lot to think about in this space. Our assessment is just the heat from buildings alone is around 26% of the UK's total carbon emissions. So nearly a quarter of our emissions is just from the energy use and the heating in our homes. So that's huge. The only bigger sector is transport. So this is going to require a really sustained effort and long-term planning to address, which of course is very difficult in a system, a political system, but also just the kind of the way that human nature works, that tends to be much more focused on the short term and immediate actions. And there are those trade-offs there for us are one of the huge challenges. So how can we deliver carbon savings now, the carbon savings that we need to deliver to meet our carbon budgets, but also be putting in place those long-term plans that will get us to net zero by 2050, and what are the tensions in that space? One of the key things for us, and you drew this out in your report, is government, because of the scale and the complexity of what we're trying to do, has a bit of a bad habit, a bad history of working in silos. And it's increasingly clear that in this space, we are not going to be able to deliver if we continue to approach it that way. So one of the key things for us, we said at the end of 2018 that we are committed to bringing out a roadmap for heat policy this year. One of the key shifts in our thinking as we've been developing what we think that roadmap will need to do and what we think the content will need to be is that we don't think a roadmap that only and purely addresses the issue of decarbonising heat is going to be adequate in this space. So our current thinking is to extend the scope of that roadmap to all buildings emissions. We think that you need to be looking at energy efficiency measures, energy using products, and heat as a holistic picture if you are going to deliver the really transformative change that you need in this space. So in practice, in the 2020s, this means we're going to need to significantly raise the building standards for new build. It's going to be increasingly important that we work to shrink the retrofit challenge as we move forward. But also in the 2020s, we're going to need to grip that retrofit challenge and grip it very firmly if we're to make the progress that we need in this space, both to meet carbon budgets and to make sure we're on that pathway to 2050. So some of the key areas that we'll be looking at, oh, sorry, one sec. So some of the key areas we're looking at is extending support for home energy efficiency improvements, through continuing to fund eco out to 2028, continuing to support homes in real poverty, and starting to think about areas of the market where we can make significant inroads around sort of natural trigger points. So particularly thinking about the domestic private rented sector, where those trigger points maybe come a bit more frequently than they do in the owner-occupier sector. So we've committed to introducing the Future Homes Standard by 2025, which will address that new build question, and the consultation on that is open now, or maybe has just closed, and I think it's just closed, and we're reviewing responses. We've also said that later this year we will consult on extending that into the retrofit space, which is something that MHCLG are leading on. We've got our current programs for incentivising renewable and low carbon heating, so the RHI, the Heat Network Investment Project, and we've also got a number of commitments. So we've said that we will phase out high emission fossil fuel heating in properties off the gas grid. We will increase the proportion of low carbon gas in the grid, and we are going to be looking at ways to drive the deployment of low carbon heating in properties on the gas grid as well. So including through heat networks and starting to see greater penetration of heat pumps, while we continue the quite extensive program of work that we have to better understand the feasibility, the safety, the compatibility with net zero, and the cost of hydrogen for heat. So the heat and building strategy is going to try to bring all of this together. I'm hoping that it will set out quite a comprehensive plan of action for the 2020s, with really clear signals about when things are going to be happening, and also set out what we think are those key decisions that unlock the long term, and also when we think that we are going to be in a position to take those. We set out in our 2018 report quite a lot of the work we're doing on building the evidence in that space. So we'll be able to share a little bit of progress in that space and what we think are the priorities going forward. Some of the kind of key pieces of thinking that need to cut across this are, one of the things that we think we really need to do is move away from thinking about this in a purely technocratic way and thinking about it very much more in the way that it impacts on people. So really key things that we will be looking to address in our strategy are: how can we support the development and in some cases rapid growth of supply chains, which is going to be absolutely critical both to delivering change at scale, but also to that consumer proposition, and thinking through what is that consumer proposition. So if we are going to be asking people to change, we need to be clear that we have got technologies and home solutions that are going to work for them. We're going to need to be clear that we've got the supply chains to support it and to install it, so that it will function reliably and that people get a really good experience. And we will need to ensure that vulnerable consumers are protected. So we will have to think about how we can do this in a way that is fair and how costs are socialized through society. So I think we'll come back to quite a lot of these points in discussion later, so I won't labor them now. We're planning to publish our strategy later this year. Obviously, things are a little uncertain at the moment, but current planning is for this to be as soon as possible after recess. So that's what we're really gunning for at the moment. We will have to see kind of how much of government is distracted by what's going on now and how much we need to be refocused in the short term to deal with what's happening. But at the moment, that's what we're planning for. We're clear, and our ministers are clear, that this is a real priority for the department. So I would hope that this is not something that slips down that priority list anytime soon. Yeah, and we are going to be working closely with people as we develop this. So really looking forward to hearing the views of others. Thank you.
Excellent, Liz. Thanks very much. It's very helpful to understand the kind of where government's thinking of, where you see some of the big issues in that journey. And we'll, as you said, we'll as we move on and come on to questions and discussion, we'll no doubt pick up some more of this. Okay, so next we're going to kind of come back to the studio, so you'll actually be able to see the speakers for the next bit, which is great. And I'm going to ask Johnny to just kick us off by talking a little bit about some of the key themes of the report, experience of writing it, and the sort of, and ask him what is the answer.
Okay. Yeah, I was slightly dreading that question, and I think I echo what Liz said about the complexity of this area. Actually, it's we set out to write a short, concise paper, partly to summarise where we are at the moment, but also to look forward to a future direction for heat decarbonisation. And it's very difficult to isolate that particular topic from all the other things that are happening around emissions in buildings, for example, and industrial processes, etc. as well. I think in writing the paper, I mean, one of the things that struck me was the context of decades, really, where we have not really put sufficient focus and emphasis on efficient building. And I remember last year when we had a meeting down at an architect's office in London, they basically said to us, one of the fundamental issues in Britain is that since the war, we haven't built houses of the standard that we need in order to decarbonise or to address those other issues around fuel poverty, for example. So in a way, we're trying to make up for several decades of lack of investment and lack of focus on energy efficiency, and that's something that, irrespective of the decarbonisation challenge, I think we need to address. When you look at the figures in the UK for fuel poverty, which is between 10 and 12%, depending on how you measure it, but particularly in areas like Scotland, for example, and some more deprived areas, we have fuel poverty figures running, over 25%, and that's a major issue. So it is a big challenge, but it's a big opportunity. In a way, there's an opportunity to put right what we haven't done over the last few decades. I think the other key theme coming through is looking again a little bit historically at measures that have been taken, like the RHI and ECO, for example, and various regulatory or subsidy interventions. Again, echoing what Liz said, is that taken in isolation, those things just do not work. You need to have a combination of market incentives, regulation, supply chain offering really good solutions, and most importantly, and I think the paper emphasises this, you have to have a market pull. You have to have demand coming from consumers that want to see those new products. One of the things that Mark did was looked at how other successful technologies have been deployed, and for instance, the uptake of gas boilers or gas central heat, which is a good example. And really underpinning that uptake was the fact that people saw that this was a good solution that offered them greater utility, greater comfort, etc., at a good price. And I think that's one of the key things that I think the paper has focused on.
Excellent. Okay.
You okay? Look at the background.
Okay. So one of the kind of headline, I guess, most eye-catching recommendations in the report is about switching the environmental levies, the costs that we all pay on our electricity bill, into a kind of carbon levy that's paid across fuels, which should essentially reduce the price of electricity and put up the price of gas to some extent, at least. Is that really, do you think that's viable? Do you want to say a little bit more about how you might think that would work?
It's definitely viable, and I mean, if you ask economists and around the world now, I mean, getting the right carbon price signals is absolutely essential to get to net zero. And frankly, we haven't really done that. I mean, we're offering signals through things like the RHI, but in a way, we're then contradicting those by having a distorted fuel price. Where, for those of you in the audience who haven't seen this, I mean, at the moment, the environmental levies that we apply are predominantly applied to electricity, and for the domestic consumer adds, I think the Ofgem figure is about 21% of the bill, whereas the equivalent on use of fossil fuels is less than 2% of the bill. So, I mean, the expression was used, pushing water up a hill. It's very hard to persuade people to switch technologies or even to, consider switching technologies when the message they're still getting is that using fossil fuels, particularly using gas, is a cheap option. It's the cheapest option. And therefore, I mean, the message we're giving is that it's okay. It's okay to carry on. So we're not using that carbon price signal in a positive way to signal to people that we want them to shift from one technology to another. So we've done a little bit of, it's very high level analysis of what that might mean. But in effect, if we took the existing environmental levy without any additional revenue raising and converted it into a carbon levy, it would have the effect of reducing the electricity bill by about 14%, domestic electricity bill, and it would increase the price of fossil fuels and natural gas by a roughly equivalent amount. For the average dual fuel customer, the net effect should balance out. There would be, in effect, a zero net sum impact, but it would clearly also have quite serious distribution effects on those people who are relying heavily on fossil fuels for their heating. Some of those people maybe need to be encouraged to be more energy efficient, but there'll also be quite a number of people who might be stuck in inefficient homes or in a fuel poverty situation. And I think any move along those lines would have to be accompanied by really aggressive action to deal with fuel poverty. A plus side was those using electricity for heating would see a reduction in their electricity bill. And a statistic we came across is that if you are using electricity for your heating, you're twice as likely to be in fuel poverty. So there is certainly a group of consumers there that this would address. It would clearly be very political, very social as well. I think that sort of shift would have to be accompanied by really strong messaging around the rationale behind it and explaining the equality of it, if you like, the fairness of it, and the fact that we're shifting to a carbon pricing.
Okay, thank you. One of the other kind of big issues that comes up in any debate about decarbonisation of heat is it quite swiftly often moves into a kind of, it's all about electrify everything. It's one option for the future, or it's all about hydrogen, and you get almost, I don't know, techno kind of
ideological
yes, it almost seems to be an ideological issue. Which is our ideology?
Well, the real challenge when you look at either of those pathways, electrification on the one hand or hydrogen on the other, is that they both involve a lot of investment. And if we went the electrification route, that has some key advantages for us in terms of using renewable electricity. We've seen the cost of renewable electricity coming down, so that's an obvious thing to do. But we would have to beef up the electricity network, particularly to deal with that peak winter load. And this is a really important thing to say about heat, is that much more than other demand sources, it's heavily weighted towards the winter cold period. And therefore, we would have to think very carefully about electricity storage and increasing the capacity of the network to do that. Lots of flexibility, lots of smart technology that we can use to mitigate that, but we would nevertheless have to increase the size of the electricity network. And I don't think we've really quantified what that actually means. I mean, there's a few studies that come out in the billions. I think there was a figure of 49 billion to cover not just heat, but also electrification of transport as well in the distribution network. But we've really got to get a handle on that in the next couple of years. If we move over to hydrogen, I mean, hydrogen has a number of key advantages as well. Hydrogen via electrolysis gives us the option to use a lot of the excess renewable electricity we might be generating from offshore wind, for example, and convert that into hydrogen, which is a medium for storing that energy and then applying that in the wintertime period. The challenge for hydrogen, though, like electricity, is the cost in some ways of that storage. But right now, it's also the production costs of hydrogen. At the moment, the production costs of hydrogen, although they will come down, the projection is still much higher than the current cost of natural gas, maybe 3 or 4 times the cost of natural gas, somewhere between 4 and 7 pence per kilowatt hour. And again, I mean, a good thing about hydrogen is that there's lots of innovation going in there at the moment. There's lots of projects underway, but until we really understand what those costs are, it's unclear whether hydrogen will be a focused fuel for use in transportation, industrial processes, where there's high value, or whether it can become a ubiquitous heating fuel used commonly throughout houses and domestic properties. You asked where we are at the moment. I think, you know, Mark and I, having done this paper, our position is, I think electrification is kind of the most obvious route, and where you have energy efficient properties and homes, I think it's the clear kind of thing to do, particularly because you can start that now if you can overcome some of the consumer issues around adopting new technologies and heat pumps, for etc. But if we think about a more balanced approach, I think there's definitely a role for hydrogen, particularly where we have industrial clusters and high heat demand. And I'd also mention biomethane as well, particularly where there are concentrations of biomethane for local solutions, you know, rural areas, off-gas grid properties, or where there's high concentrations, potentially within a you know, smaller networks. So I'm not dodging the question, but there probably is a balanced approach, and we need to use all of these tools because they all have their role and their place.
Okay, so it's a more nuanced, depending on where there isn't one answer for the whole country. I think it's a more.
And that brings in the regional question and regional strategies and regional plans. I don't think this can be driven as a top-down thing, okay, either from a technical point of view or, more importantly, from a democratic point of view. I mean, this is going to involve a lot of change for people, and we need to have the buy-in and support and the endorsement of that change, which can only be done through local regions and communities.
Okay, I just refer people, I think everyone should have had a copy of the report sent to you, but I think if you registered before 9, if you've registered since then, we'll get you a note afterwards, but it'll be on our website. I think, is it up there at the moment?
Yes, on the homepage of the website.
Yeah. Okay, so if you go to the Regen website, you'll find the report. Just on the peak, page 39 has a table of gas supplies to meet peak winter days and a figure of 5.1 terawatt hours for UK onshore gas, sort of a typical cold winter day. Chris, when we come to Chris, I'm sure he can tell us a great deal about that from Wales and West, but it's interesting that we don't tend to see those kind of figures in these discussions of decarbonisation of heat before, but it's kind of sobering figure of 5 terawatt hours for a cold winter day, and it does emphasise your point there about this is a lot about peak.
So that figure has come from National Grid's winter projections, where they're calculating what they think the capacity of the network would be, and it includes, I should say, as well as the heat demand from gas, also the demand for gas for electricity generation. It's about 25% or 26% on a cold winter day.
Okay.
So there's a totality of energy that has to be delivered.
Yeah.
If we went down the electrification route, it wouldn't be the same number if we're using heat pumps, for example, because we do get a coefficient of performance there of, you know, between 2.5 and 4,
yeah,
and therefore there's less heat required. But nevertheless, I mean, it's a big number. It's a very big number. That's the important point.
It's interesting to see UK continental shelf beach landings and figures like this, which perhaps for those of the audience who have perhaps been more involved in electricity and less in the world of gas, perhaps unfamiliar terms, in terms that as we think about whole system solutions and net zero, then we're going to have to perhaps come a little bit more familiar with this whole system that perhaps some of us haven't understood quite so well. Okay, Mark, come to first question I was going to ask is marbles. So for those that haven't had this, there's a picture of a marble on the front with a flame in it, and then you go in and there's a marble run there. You'll be familiar with that from your playing it from school, I'm sure, primary school. Play a lot with marbles as a kid. What gives where's the marble come from?
So my children do, which is part of the inspiration for this. But I think one of the things from my experience of working in the industry for a number of years, delivering renewable heating systems, and our conversations with industry and various stakeholders in producing this paper, is that all of the schemes to date in terms of, you know, rolling out energy efficiency, higher quality new builds, decarbonising heat solutions have been a bit like, you know, pushing water up a hill. It's really challenging, and what we see is as soon as grants and incentives and schemes disappear, installation rates tend to fall and installers tend to disappear and go back to doing what they were doing before. And so it's not led to a sustainable supply chain or a sustainable market for these solutions of energy efficiency and low carbon heat. So the idea of the marble run is that once you've put the right pieces in place, then actually with a little nudge, you get to where you want to be in a fairly straightforward way. But you've got to build those pieces together first. And so that's the analogy that we try to use a little bit with the paper, is that we should maybe stop pushing water up a hill and try and sort of reset things. Talking about the carbon levy, that's part of that idea, is resetting that level so that actually we're putting things in our favour, and we can work towards that net zero goal in a bit of an easier fashion.
Okay, excellent. Very helpful analogy, I think, from my point of view. I'm sure Liz will be very keen on getting the marble going downhill rather than trying to push it up. Okay, talk a lot about energy efficiency in this. I mean, that point about peak, and if you could shrink that peak, everything, the whole problem gets easier. There's a lot of stuff about, we've really got to get going on this, and the scandal of UK's inefficient homes. There's some figures in there which are a bit shocking about us at the bottom of the European League for thermal efficiency. So, in writing this report, Regen's drawing a lot on projects it's done. You personally have been sort of leading some of that work and work on the front line of installation. So just give us a bit more into what's going wrong. Why have all these initiatives, all these green deals, everything else? Why are we just sort of playing around at the edges? Why have we not managed to start to really address that problem when it comes to heat, particularly?
I think we have a tendency to focus on the unit cost of electricity and on the financial benefits that we'll reap from installing an efficiency measure or moving to a low carbon heating solution. So one of the problems there is, obviously we talked about gas, very cheap and convenient at the moment. So that's in essence always stacked against any argument. And then the tendency to focus on a single benefit from energy efficiency or decarbonisation is really missing the whole picture. And there's a diagram in the report from the IEA, which looks at the multiple benefits of energy efficiency. And I think that's what we need to think about in refocusing our approaches as we move forward, is thinking about not just the cost benefits that are going to come from delivering energy, delivering low carbon heat, but thinking about the well-being that people can get from being in a warmer, more comfortable home. Think about the economic benefits we can get from building our manufacturing sector if we do more off-site manufacturing, for example, which has been a big component of the whole house retrofit program that we've been involved in, and I think makes an awful lot of sense. And so it's really about trying to capture all of those benefits into the market through different approaches that normalise the decarbonisation and normalise actually having a warm and comfortable home, and understanding that that's a positive thing. And that's where zero carbon new builds can really lead the way and show the market that actually there is a lot of value to energy efficiency and low carbon heat, and that it's not just about cost.
Okay, you mentioned kind of this whole house retrofit approach, and tends to go under the label of energy sprong or energy leap, I think the Dutch term, isn't it? And there's an interesting stat in the kind of case study in the report on page 29 that suggests that I think this is the Dutch figure, that 50 million euros has led to a self-sustaining market that developed 2,000 whole house retrofits, and contrast that with the UK Green Deal, which costs 170 million, and kind of achieved essentially much less. So what is it about those two approaches that, why have the Dutch been better? Why are the Dutch so much better than us?
Why are they so much better than us? It's really interesting, and actually the numbers are higher than that now. So the scheme now in the Netherlands, they've delivered 12,000 net zero buildings. Half of them are retrofits.
Okay.
So about 6,000 those energy sprong style retrofits. I think the biggest thing has been making a commitment to deliver something, actually. So it's the energy sprong approach uses off-site manufacture, which has the potential to be very low cost and very quick to deliver and deliver high performance, but at the start it's obviously expensive. People need to invest in new skills and new tooling and performance guarantees. So that's something that they overcame by making a commitment, an agreement between industry, between the public sector, that over 100,000 of these style retrofits would be delivered. And that's allowed the supply chain to invest in new technologies, in new approaches, to bring the cost down in that time by over 50% delivering these. So I think one thing is that provision of a long-term stable signal to the market that's allowed supply chains to invest in tools and in stuff.
Okay, thank you, Mark. And there are 14 houses, is that 15 that in Exeter currently being energy spawned?
15 in Devon.
15 in Devon, sorry, currently energy spawned. So there's some interesting data coming out of those energy others around the country. Johnny,
yeah, I just wanted to come in on that point about why some markets work and some markets don't. And I think one of the things that's curious in the UK is our housing market and our rental market doesn't really value energy efficiency. And you would expect that if you had an energy efficient house with a high performance EPC, for example, that would command a higher value whether you're selling it or renting it. And that doesn't seem to be the case. And I think in the Netherlands, actually, it very much is the case. In fact, I don't think most Dutch people would consider buying a house or renting a house unless it was energy efficient. So we're not sending the right signals through our market for buildings to really put a premium on energy efficient and low carbon housing. We're trying to drive it all through the unit price of electricity, which, as Mark said, is only giving a kind of a snapshot, incentive. And at the moment, that unit price isn't really working in our favor. So, I think as alongside a carbon price, other measures through the rental market, through the way we apply rates, and the way in which we might apply stamp duty, for example, would send a much stronger signal to house buyers and renters that would actually increase the value of a building, and therefore building owners and occupiers would have an incentive to invest.
Okay, excellent. A lot for Liz to talk to the Treasury about, which I'm sure she does regularly. Obviously, a key part of tackling a challenge as big as this is a whole government approach, and we'll come back to that. Okay, I was going to come to Chris, who is Technical Director at Wales and West Utilities, and who has very kindly supported the paper for us, and some of the issues that we've been talking about with here about the kind of scale of energy that's delivered through the gas network, the amount of storage it provides, the kind of way it deals with huge winter peak, much greater than anything the electricity system has to deal with, are kind of right in the sweet spot of the issues that Chris has been dealing with. Chris, I think can you hear us?
Yeah, morning Merlin, can you hear me now?
We can. Unfortunately, again, we can't see Chris. Some people's security systems seem to defeat our kind of the webcam software, but we can hear you, Chris. So hand over to you for your kind of thoughts and reactions to what you've heard.
Yeah, I suppose welcome the opportunity to start with, and I suppose a few reflections on the report as a starting point. I think what the report does is just outline the scale of the challenge. We know from other obvious things that consumers tend to be hard to reach. People won't even switch tariffs to save them money. Implementation of things is difficult. Look at smart meter rollout. Fitting a meter is easy, and yet we run into some problems. And I think this report is one of the first things to address these kinds of challenges. So I think that's a bit of a first from my experience. I think by outlining the existing scenario and how it works now, and I think you mentioned the 5.1 terawatt hours, and don't forget, as we change our transport system, whilst the heating number may go down, the transport bit will go up. So at 5.1 terawatt hours a day, is a huge challenge. I think these facts are not well known. In some cases, even within the industry, there are many people who perhaps don't know how the energy system works at the moment, where our electrons and molecules come from. I suppose one observation, we tend to focus because it's our own personal thinking about our homes, but we shouldn't forget business and industry. And of course, within this field, that can't be segregated. It all taps into the same energy system. So I think as we consider what we do in our homes and businesses, especially as Johnny mentioned, around perhaps a more regional approach, what industry does, they may lead potentially, and that gives opportunities for others to follow in their wake. I suppose a few key points that I'd like to draw out, probably haven't been touched on yet, so I won't repeat some of the great stuff that's been talked about already. But I like the partnership point. We're increasingly finding ourselves more and more in partnership with electricity distribution network operators. But I think those partnerships probably need to be wider than we're thinking about. Is partners of two are not enough now in an overall energy system, an overall buildings system, because inherently now what we do in our buildings, maybe our appliances, is linked to what the supply source is, and that will be variable in different parts of the country. So I think partnerships need to be much, much bigger. I don't think we've really made much inroad into that as a country yet. Clearly, interesting points about the levies. Just be cautious that, of course, probably use 3 times more kilowatt hours of heat than we do electricity. So just the balance of how we shift levies or taxes is clearly going to be a big one. If I then turn to some of the solutions, and I was really pleased to hear Liz talk about buildings, because I think solutions are bigger than the appliance, and I think we have focused on the appliance before. I think all technologies have their challenges, and I think the report's drawn that out, and I think for the first time sort of perhaps puts them on an even a level playing field. So we talk about hydrogen, and you quite rightly point out that there's a lot of progress on hydrogen now. It is going to happen, and more people seem to be confirmed that is a requirement, certainly for industry and for power generation, and therefore in the wake of that there could be areas of the UK that would suit hydrogen in a way that perhaps we haven't thought about before. Clearly heat pumps have got a role. You could fit a heat pump now. What isn't obvious about when you fit a heat pump is the impact on the wider system, not just generation and the supply, but also things like storage. And at the moment, we as a gas network are actually finding an increase in requirements for power generation. Therefore, the more we drive that, we risk in the short term driving up fossil fuel generation. So the careful balance, I think, is there now. I might come on to our vision later on, but as a company and where we see heat decarbonisation going. But I think there are a couple of points that I'd probably highlight. One was the hybrid case study, something Western Power Distribution ourselves are very familiar with, and that's on page 43. That's a technology that if most people are divided into a hydrogen camp or an electrification camp, then hybrid sort of sits somewhere in the middle, so everybody dislikes it. And yet I think it's a technology we should be taking a little bit more seriously. The other key point in the chart, which was interesting on page 47, and it came from ourselves in response to this request for information of this report, just to find out how much biomethane was being produced, because it gets averaged over either the country or quite large regions. We, even ourselves, didn't realise we had some quite high hotspots in our region. As Merlin mentioned, the North Gloucester region is now up to 12% biomethane. Most people dismiss it as being just too small to be bothered with. But I think maybe one of the points the report hasn't linked yet sufficiently is how technologies can be used together. And that's where I think, in a hybrid world in North Gloucestershire, with their high quantities of biomethane, could actually decarbonise heat to homes and small business. And that could be done now, and therefore I think thinking how we couple the vectors is something we need to think about. So I'll leave it there for the moment. Merlin, if you want to come back to me, perhaps a little bit more around what our vision looks like and how it all joins together, then happy to share that later.
Okay, Chris, just kind of one follow-up. I mean, you're in the midst of your RIIO-2 price control round, and of course, following shortly on afterwards, the electricity networks are as well. So these are kind of, okay, 5-year, but I think they take us up to 2028 in terms of electricity, a little bit earlier in terms of gas, so a critical period in the kind of decarbonisation and net zero journey. What clearly we haven't got is from central government yet is a strong signal about the kind of balance of the electrification, which is going to need the distribution network, or the green gas, which need the gas network kind of solutions. I wonder, how do the utilities go around making these big infrastructure investment decisions now in the absence of those clear signals? Do you think there's a need for greater leadership, or is it possible? Are we still in the stage where we can kind of trial lots of things, let 1,000 flowers bloom, maintain optionality, and still kind of, as some of the longer term solutions become clearer, still be the infrastructure be ready to meet them rather than become a real barrier? Do you have a view on that?
Yes, so certainly. So I had the pleasure of submitting our business plan just weeks, in fact, after it's printed, weeks after net zero was announced. So kind of it hasn't come late in the day, because we anticipated this and we were already planning for 80% reduction. So yeah, we put a business plan in that aims to hit the no regrets actions. So on a pathway that in all scenarios that investment would be secure. Where it isn't, and perhaps where we see perhaps regional differences emerging, and perhaps particularly different demands on the network, we have covered that off by something called an uncertainty allowance. So effectively, you know, we wouldn't invest necessarily ahead of need, and we'd only want recognition for that investment after it was completely certain. So we have, you know, we have put in, I think, in a really ambitious business plan. We aim to provide a low-cost, low-carbon green gas network by 2035, but it's ready now. You know, it's ready now for green gas, as we were just talking about. But we do put some investment in to double the capacity for green gas into our network over those 5 years. We put in investment potentially for increasing power generation in the short term as sort of coal and nuclear comes off and demand increases for transport. We face as a country a bit of a pinch point for short duration generation at low cost, and we're seeing a rise in demand for that ourselves. And of course, starting to decarbonise heavy transport. So whilst a little bit outside the realm of today, you can't really separate these things. They're all so interlinked nowadays. I think the networks are addressing that issue of how we're all linked together now. And certainly we've been working very closely with Scottish Southern Electricity Networks in the Swindon area to design a local area energy network. We've done projects with Western Power Distribution as well to try and see a sort of joined up approach. You know, competition and between networks is not helpful if that costs the consumer an additional penny. That's not acceptable.
Okay, thank you very much, Chris. Okay, let's come to another of our panelists. I think we've got Tim there. So Tim is from the Energy System Catapult. Catapult's been, for those of you that listen to the Today programme at 5 to 7 in the morning, you'll have heard Tim's colleague, Guy New, he's the strategy director at the Catapult, talking about some thinking they've come out with today. Catapult's obviously been doing quite a lot around heat. I remember going to a conference that Tim compared back in the summer, which was around very much around customers and consumers and their experience and different ways of providing heat as a service, different ideas of trying to kind of change the thinking from a consumer point of view about heat. And we actually have Tim on the webcam live. The technology is actually working. So Tim, this is Exeter calling. We're handing over to you in London.
Hi, Tim.
Hi, Johnny. Hi, Mark. Hi, Merlin. How are you doing? Thank you very much for this opportunity. Yeah, I mean, if you heard Guy Newey, who was on the Today programme this morning, we have a new report which is coming out about innovating for net zero, and pretty challenging actually. So I recommend everybody to try and get hold of that. And have a look at it. So I was just listening into what Chris was saying and aligning our thoughts with that. And also, I just want to congratulate you, first of all, on what is an excellent report you've just brought out. It's brilliant. Well done. There are a couple of things, additional things, I suppose, that we would potentially add to what you put into that. One of those, I suppose, you wouldn't be surprised to hear, and it ties in with a lot about what Chris was talking about, is the need for building partnerships. Local energy partnerships and I go together for a long time with my colleagues sitting in the room there with you and Johnny. So very important, I believe, and now the time is absolutely right for that. So, and the other thing I would say very clearly, hopefully, is that we believe that the need for local area energy planning to help to determine all the things you put in your report, what are the right solutions for the right places across the whole of the UK, is an absolutely necessary thing going forward. And that's gaining a lot of traction nationally at the moment. Local authorities all wanting to, well, many local authorities signing the climate change declaration and bringing the target forward from 2050 up to 2030 in many cases. Very challenging. So the report you brought out about decarbonising heat is obviously one of the major challenges that the Energy Systems Catapult has been addressing, and prior to that through the Energy Technologies Institute through its Smart Systems and Heat programme. So yeah, so I would just like to make very clear the opportunities, I think, for local energy planning, because these solutions that are necessary are going to vary on a place-to-place basis. And to do local energy planning, you need to bring all the right partners together. So it joins up a lot of what Chris was just saying.
Okay, thank you, Tim. The whole kind of local area energy strategy is something that Regen's been doing a lot of work on and kind of around the country. So, and it does seem to be coming as a bit of a theme of today's discussion, that perhaps we need to move on a little bit from the kind of, I think I described it as techno ideology into some kind of pragmatic, actually, in a particular region, particular area of the country, what is the right solution. That's going to bring in a whole load of actors and people that perhaps haven't been involved in some of these decisions in the past, which is a dynamic we're beginning to see. Okay, I'm going to try and bring in Nathan now, I think, who is from the National Infrastructure Commission. So flushed with the success of Tim working, we're going to see if Nathan can join us. National Infrastructure Commission clearly is key player in this, kind of government's key advisor on infrastructure, and formally reporting into Treasury, and just another report out from the Commission today, I think, was it yesterday, which is about the future of power. Linking back to heat as well, but in the National Infrastructure Assessment, there's quite a lot in there about heat and energy efficiency, the importance of that. Nathan, can you hear us?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
We can. Excellent. You're on the line.
Fantastic. Brilliant. Well, thanks very much. I'll try not to sort of, just reiterate too many of the points that have already been said. We've already had some good discussion, and I definitely agree with the vast majority of what's been said. I suppose just quickly to kind of cover the introductions on the National Infrastructure Commission side of things. Our thinking on the heat space dates back to about, 2018, when we published our National Infrastructure Assessment. And that's a sort of document which we set out once a Parliament, and it's intended to provide strategic advice to the UK government on the UK's long-term infrastructure needs. And obviously one of the key things, as we've discussed today, is what happens with heat going forward to 2050. I think that as part of the National Infrastructure Assessment, we wanted to make, you know, robust, pragmatic recommendations on how the UK could decarbonise the heating sector, but obviously ran into the challenges that everyone who tries to think about heat and make recommendations on heat runs into, which is that, you know, this is a very gnarly problem, as we've mentioned, and the evidence base isn't necessarily spectacular in the sense that we need to deploy lots of new technologies, so there's uncertainty around how those technologies are going to work, and there's also uncertainties about how consumers are going to interact with those technologies, which is obviously a large part of this. So the recommendations we made in NIA were very much centred on the near term, what could government do in the next 5 years to try and remove some of this uncertainty and make it easier to make these types of decisions. And so we were recommending things like ensuring that the safety case for hydrogen has been completed by 2021, ensuring that we have large-scale generation of low-carbon hydrogen through gas reforming by 2023, ensuring that we've got an up-to-date evidence base on electrification and how heat pumps operate. The one thing which I think has been mentioned as already that kind of stands out, and I think is recognised in your paper, where that's not really the case, is on energy efficiency, where it's quite clear that we need to be moving as fast as possible and installing energy efficiency measures in most buildings, and that's quite a sort of, in terms of making a decision on that, that's relatively easy. There's obviously a whole host of challenges in terms of actually getting that done. So that's kind of where we fell out in our national infrastructure assessment, and I think that, you know, the paper that you've published, I think, is really good, echoes a lot of those same sort of recommendations and concerns, and I think it's good to see it sort of reflecting a change in the discussion which has happened over the last few years from the kind of, as has already been mentioned, kind of purely techno-economic perspective to recognising the role, the integral role that consumers are going to play in this transition. I think two, thinking about it less from a just one big centralised decision, which is maybe where the discussion was a few years ago, to the more pragmatic perspective that this is going to be different in different regions. You know, different regions of the country are very different in terms of where they can get their energy from, what the consumers might think, what the building stocks are like. And so thinking of it less as just kind of one big country decision and more of sort of set of regions is very welcome as well. And I think the third thing as well is recognising that it's not, as you've already discussed, it's not and it's never going to be either hydrogen or electrification. It is ultimately very likely to be some form of blend of both of those. I think there's, you know, some good signs on some of those things coming out from government, or more just generally. So thinking about the kind of consumer perspective thing, this is obviously a kind of a transition that's happened slightly wider across the whole policy space, where government now thinks a lot more about how consumers or taxpayers interact with its policy. And I think we as a country have gotten a lot better at integrating that into policy making. And hopefully that's a kind of positive sign for the future in terms of how it's adopted in the various policy programs that are developed to decarbonise heat. The one thing I'd want to sort of caveat all that with is that I think it's still really important to bear in mind the sort of techno-economic whole systems perspective on these questions, and not get too carried away that it's all about the consumer and we should kind of throw out all the techno-economic whole systems approach. I think it's integral to keep both in mind. So some of the whole system questions which I think are really relevant when thinking about these different pathways, which some of them haven't necessarily been touched on so far, are when we think about electrification, there's a number of challenges that crop up, and we've already talked about kind of the additional demands on the electricity networks, what upgrades will be required, and there's a lot of uncertainty there, especially sort of at the distribution level, and the challenges of putting a load more peak demand on the system. I think one opportunity on the other side of that is that if we have heat pumps in people's homes, that potentially gives us access to a lot of thermal storage. So we could flex when people are using heat pumps, and that would provide a huge amount of flexibility to the electricity grid. There was a report which Imperial College did for the Committee on Climate Change back in 2018, which looked into this and identified that as a huge opportunity. I think another sort of whole systems point, which is touched on in the paper, but it's worth really thinking about, is what we do with the various forms of biomass and whether they can be used in heating or not. I think the Committee on Climate Change in their Net Zero report are quite clear that biomass really should be used where possible with carbon capture and storage technologies to generate the negative emissions. So it might be a really attractive solution to use to decarbonise heating. But I think if we take that whole systems perspective, we might question, is this getting the best decarbonisation out of the resources that we have? So I suppose I just wanted to definitely welcome all that sort of consumer perspective that the paper is taking and the discussions had, but just flag that we still need that wider whole systems perspective. And then just finally to close, sorry, hopefully I haven't gone on for too long. I think that the recommendations we set out in the National Infrastructure Assessment really underline the sort of urgency of the problem. We need to get moving on this quite quickly. We made those recommendations back in 2018. Others have made similar recommendations prior to that and since that. And I think that it's great the government are thinking hard about this strategy towards the middle of the year, but we'll be very keen to see some action on this being taken.
Okay,
that's
excellent. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Nathan. We'll be looking forward to more from the National Infrastructure Commission on this, and I believe we're due at some point with the budget or soon after to have a kind of response to that from the government and a national infrastructure plan. So that'll be another document coming out of government that we're hoping to see, though Liz has mentioned there may be some delays in current circumstances. Johnny, I just that question that we picked up about the balance between consumer, local things, and not forgetting that actually this is a whole joined up energy system, and Chris kind of brought us back to that as well. How we kind of get that balance right between kind of local consumer solution and making the whole thing out more efficiently.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point, actually. I think what we're trying to do in the report is maybe redress the balance a little bit from an energy industry perspective, or perhaps we haven't focused sufficiently on the consumer, but ultimately the overall system has to work. I mean, biomethane is a good example of that, where we need to be quite strategic about how we use biomethane. I mean, how we apply that particular resource, because it will have a very high value. A low carbon thermal fuel will have a very high value in the future. I think it goes to the question about what we mean by regional partnerships, and what we don't mean is regional islands of decision making. I think there is a risk that individual cities, regions will go off and say, right, well, we're going to be the hydrogen capital, we're going to be the electrification capital, we're going to do other things without really considering what's happening across the whole system. So that partnership needs to involve national decision-making, policy, and needs to understand the evidence behind the technical and economic factors. And I mean, we are a little bit of a wait at the moment, because some of that evidence isn't quite there yet. So in terms of building partnerships at the moment, I think we're definitely encouraging a wider partnership with networks, but also local authorities, with businesses, thinking about the supply chain, understanding the local building stock, understanding issues around fuel poverty, for example, and then applying those issues or looking at those issues in the context of what's happening in the national policies in terms of what are the options, what are the technical options, and how does that fit together as a system. So I think Scotland is a good example of this. I mean, they've put a lot of effort into this, and if you look at the various, because heat is a devolved issue in Scotland, but they put a lot of measures together, bringing in the periphery of things like supply chain development and their policies around, fuel poverty and vulnerable customers, and that's all being brought together at the moment. I'm not sure they've actually quite executed all of that yet in terms of a strategy that's deliverable, but you can see them building putting the building blocks together for that strategy.
Excellent. Okay. Well, we've heard about how the Dutch are much better at that. Now the Scots are much better. So a lot of people, lots for us to learn from. Anyway,
the Scots are us. So
okay. Yes. I was thinking okay. We also have Maxine as a panelist. So John was just talking about the whole system and regulating, making the whole system work, and that was sort of Maxine's background, obviously working in Ofgem. Now as a freelancer, getting a lot of different perspectives. I guess, Maxine, do you want to come and give us your thoughts on the paper and some of the issues raised?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, firstly, just to say, I think it's a really excellent paper, and giving that focus. Sorry. The focus on the need for immediate action, which is, there is a risk, I think, that we all sort of sit on our hands waiting for BEIS to produce the final answer as to whether it's hydrogen or whether it's electrification. And I think, I don't think Liz would want us sitting on our hands where there are things that can be done. But it is complicated. And one of the papers that I've just been working on is coming out shortly, is looking at Cinderella solution, as I call it, which is electric storage heating. And smart electric storage heating is a lot better than the old stuff that people might be familiar with. But as soon as you get into that, you find you're looking at the price signals and network charging reviews and the innards of the SAP mechanism, and all of those things you have got to get right if you're going to be sending the right signals to people to do the right things now. So I wanted to pull out sort of three themes, I think, from what your report, and a number of them we've touched on already. I think the first thing is regionalisation and the fact that different solutions are right in different areas. I probably take a different view from Johnny in that I don't think I want to stand in the way of a city like Bristol that is trying to develop a plan for how it wants to drive forward. I think it's district heating at the minute. It doesn't really have the ability to kind of move forward on its own, even if it's got a clear view of what it thinks is right for its area. And I think, given the scale of the challenge we've got facing us, to have a few pioneer local authorities or towns or cities that just want to drive forward is probably right. Clearly, we do need it. It needs a whole system thinking, but we're probably never going to really know what the right answer is. You pull out future price trends on hydrogen. Who knows where the price of hydrogen will be by 2050. We're never going to be 100% sure what the right answer is. So let those who want to move ahead move ahead, and I think that requires giving them some additional powers in some areas and not constraining through the Future Home Standard their ability to set different energy efficiency standards should they wish to. And then the second is on customers themselves. We have got a real momentum at the minute of customers passionate about climate change, wanting to do their bit, rise in veganism, and all sorts of things that show people are interested in trying to do what they can to tackle climate change. And I think there's very little awareness that actually how you heat your home is part of that problem. And so I think the mood is ripe for people to be given a little bit more information about what they could do in how they heat their homes, whether it's back to the turning your thermostat down by 1 degree, but actually for those who want to do something substantial to their home, it's very hard at the minute to know what you should do. So price signals are all wrong, and I think that's one of the bits of the report I thought was really excellent, was tackling that question head on, because I think all economists and everybody that comments sort of says, yeah, well, we really ought to have a price signal on carbon, but it's all a bit difficult. And I think by showing how just redistributing that is, clearly there will be some people who are worse off as a result, but it tackles it in a way that fundamentally ought to be more acceptable to people. It isn't just another tax, it's just spreading out the money from different sources. So if you get those price signals right, at least people can begin to see that electric heating is not necessarily as bad as gas, and continue to be a bit more expensive, but at the minute we're sending the signals in all the wrong directions. And that comes as well to things like the EPCs, which again you do dig into helpfully in your report, and the fact that at the minute the main EPC bit is really just a signalling the difference between gas heating and electric heating in a lot of cases. But there is the additional piece that talks about carbon intensity, but the problem is that is so out of date and assumes that electricity is still a much more carbon intensive than it currently is, and certainly than it will be in future. And while changes are being proposed to that, they're still not forward looking, they're only kind of catching up with where we are currently. So there is quite a lot to make sure that even if people don't pay a lot of heed to it at the minute, they might start to, and we need to make sure that the information that's being put out through those EPCs is really reflecting the future of where we think heating needs to go to. And I guess finally that is saying we need to keep the focus on energy efficiency, as you say. The Future Home Standard, it's right that we try to do these things through standards. I'm not really an expert, but I have picked up a bit of unhappiness around the Future Home Standard as putting less emphasis on the fabric efficiency of buildings, because it focuses it all on you know, if you've got a new build and put solar panels on the roof, then the quality of the building doesn't matter so much, and that's not right. We just need to keep having good fabric efficiency for our buildings. And I think I pick up a point from Nathan there that says, you know, you suggested we put in heat pumps, then we have thermal storage. That doesn't automatically follow. We need thermal storage if we're going to have heat pumps. And again, the Future Home Standard doesn't do anything about talking about the need for thermal storage. In fact, it's sort of hostile to any form of thermal storage, including my precious electric storage heaters, because there's a risk of leakage and therefore that's inefficient. So I think we need things like the Future Home Standard to have a whole systems layer put onto it, and for it to kind of understand how homes fit into the whole energy system, which just goes to show that really your report covers all of those different bases, and is really welcome. And I hope this debate will continue and get some products that are good for consumers and that consumers are enthusiastic.
Thank you very much, Maxine. Some similarities actually in the points about the Future Home Standards that Mark wrote in our response to that about the fabric first and letting local authorities have their not restricting their ability, which just I should give Johnny the right of reply about that he's standing in the way of all these innovative regions and cities that want to change the world, and he's supporting the dead hand of the Whitehall bureaucrats and stopping them all. After that, we'll come back to talk about Whitehall bureaucrats, but in a very positive way. Obviously, we'll come back to Liz as well.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with the point about we need to have pathfinders, and we need to have cities that are going to press ahead and test out the new technologies. I think my point was about not doing that in isolation. Basically, we don't want cities to become islands, and Bristol's a good example where they're pushing ahead with heat networks, and we're involved in supporting that at the moment. But the solutions that they adopt and the lessons they learn, and perhaps some of the pitfalls that they encounter, is something that needs to then be shared with other cities. And I think we also need to have some national policies around things like heat networks, and we've flagged up a couple of things around making sure that they're decarbonised, but also making sure that there's sufficient consumer protection around those as well. Otherwise, the danger is that some of our Pathfinder projects, rather than becoming exemplars, actually, you know, if they're seen as failing or they're seen as perhaps not protecting consumers, then they might actually set us back. And there's a really fine balance between the need to get on and do stuff and the need to, for instance, roll out heat pumps on gas properties, but making sure we do that in a very careful way so that they become good examples and not bad examples of how to do things.
Okay, we should probably just make clear that Bristol is, I know, very, very focused on looking after the consumer, and they have a part of the innovation of their heat networks is producing a whole suite of legal documents and an approach that allows consumers to make good choices and not get stuck in a bad situation, which has been one of the concerns, I guess, that people have discussed around heat networks. I know that's something they're very focused on, make sure that is a really good example. Liz, just heard a lot there, and I guess one of the issues, you know, we're all here giving you lots of our thoughts, and also, you know, giving you our best wishes and support, I guess, and you know, given the number of things that we've discussed that we had to deal with and how quickly this can go down into some quite detailed issues about the way the EPCs or standard assessment protocols that actually work in detail, out to some really huge issues about national infrastructure and the like. And just interested in what's kind of struck you out of the conversation so far, anything perhaps surprised you from what you've been hearing?
I wouldn't say any of it surprised me. So I mean, I think this has been a really great debate, and I agree with everybody. You know, the quality of the paper that's informed this is outstanding. What's really great about this debate and what's really exciting for me is how far we've come in the complexity and maturity of our thinking about the whole scale of this issue from sort of the early days in this job. So really, you know, bringing out that need for that balance between the consumer proposition and ensuring that the whole system does work and doesn't fall over, and that we don't accidentally create perverse activities like burning more fossil fuels to drive heat pumps, is really fascinating and really interesting to see. I think there's quite a lot in here for me to take away and think about how we're going to address in the report. I do think if our report's going to, if it's going to land, if it's going to do what we want it to do, it actually does need to address all of these things. A few things I'd pick out. I think first, the point that Maxine made about using this opportunity to raise awareness about this as an issue and public awareness. You know, we're in a quite unique time in terms of where the public are, their attitudes to climate change, the school strikes, Greta Thunberg, you know, the kind of the drive for governments to do something. And I think we have to, and then of course the COP that we're hosting ourselves later this year, possibly by teleconference if things don't improve.
Be a lot cheaper.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think international diplomacy's always gone better if you throw some tricky technology into the mix. But yeah, so, you know, this is a real opportunity. We're very aware of that and we want to use it. There is, I think, that balance, and this was brought out by Craig from Wales and West, I think, making sure we have that balance of not forgetting we're not just talking about the public though. And some of the things that are talked about here, you know, price signals. Now, price signals is something that we are really alive to and really thinking about a lot at the moment. It's not straightforward though, and your end state looks great. So the proposal you make where you take, you know, and you didn't say how you get there, and I think that's very important, but, you know, agreeing that we've got way too much of our environmental costs levied on electricity, and that has to be rebalanced if we're going to give the right price signals to the market. But then also thinking about the impact on energy efficiency in energy intensive industries that are currently very, very dependent on fossil fuels and do not yet have the solutions to move away from them. If we move very suddenly through price changing, so there's definitely a balance here where on the one hand we've got to give the right signals and support to consumers, we've got to have people who can be warm in their homes, we've got to look after the vulnerable, but also ideally we'll do that without it being sort of an economic disaster for the country. And finding ways to balance those out is something that we're really thinking a lot about at the moment, thinking about how we can start to address those price signals in a way that doesn't perhaps ricochet through the whole system immediately. That's a really big one for us. The question of the role of local actors, again, just brilliant to hear people talking about this, and also something we're really, really thinking about. So when I started working in this field, you know, there seemed to be quite a big assumption in government and outside it that we were waiting for one big decision that would be very top down. Nobody thinks we're in that world anymore, and ways that we can really sort of support local initiatives and really build that learning from them and share that learning from them is something, again, that's a very live issue for us at the moment. So yeah, all of this are things that we are thinking about very hard. One of the things I think that's going to be a really big challenge for us is this need for the the whole government approach and for this consistency across different departments, different levers. That's always been something that's a bit challenging, especially as departments have been set up to deliver different priorities and occasionally they come into conflict. But I think there are some really positive moves happening in government at the moment to align departments better around the challenge of meeting net zero, which I think is quite exciting.
Okay, sounds like you might be discussing joined up government there, which would be that's a brilliant idea. Fascinating to hear you kind of talk openly about the kind of what perhaps has been a bit of a sort of things like changing environmental levies and bills is always a tough one, and I'm sure it's very hard politics as well. And always get some losers, and they tend to have strong views. So I think you illustrated some of the complexities about that. But I think you are open that is something you are considering. Would that be the right interpretation?
It's something that we're thinking about very hard at the moment. Yeah, I mean, politically, of course, it's an absolute minefield. There is no way to increase the price of gas that passes the Daily Mail test. But the Daily Mail test isn't the only one that we think about happily. So it's a very live issue of consideration at the moment.
Okay, great. The Daily Mail test is not the only one government thinks of. That's good. Good news. We'll take that away. Mark, one of the things that's come up is a supply chain discussion, and the fact that there's a lot of change here, and we need the skills. And there's some quite worrying numbers in the report about the fact that the number of registered, accredited people in some of these technologies have kind of moved is lowered over the last few years rather than gone up. So rather than sort of training this army of people that can transform our homes and things, we're actually kind of going the other direction. Is that you've been working a lot, I know, with the supply chain and with businesses. How quick, I suppose, is it really a problem? If you send the right signal, will our skilled tradesmen just kind of retrain and get out there? And how big a job would it be to sort of build the supply chain we need for the kind of scale of change that we're talking about?
Yeah, I mean, it's a problem. I guess to start on a positive note, that I think that some of the indicators show that in the non-domestic sector, there's some growth in the supply chain and some positive signs there in non-domestic heat, but not in all areas of it. It is an issue. We've got a huge supply chain of there's 135,000 gas engineers in the country. We've got a great construction industry that can deliver if asked the right question. Mm-hmm. And I think the problem is that we're not asking the right question generally. Mm-hmm. And what we're asking generally for is cheap and not necessarily quality or low carbon. And that's the question we need to start asking. If we start asking that question, then we can get supply chain to deliver that, but it will take time. You can't change those things overnight. So the message that we've had consistently from the supply chain through, I would say from my experience being part of that supply chain, but also in the last 2 years working on our whole house retrofit program, is that the supply chain can and will invest if there is a clear long-term market for them to do so. And then they're able to develop technologies, develop new solutions, and to train their staff to move. But otherwise, without that long-term solution, there's very little incentive for anyone to do so. So you can take the gas engineers that provide a great response to any issues that people might have with their gas heating systems at the moment. There's little imperative for them to make a change at the moment. Okay. Given time, they can.
There's a couple of extra points in the report which Mark identified. One of the things is that the supply chain is trusted. Actually, most consumers, when they want to talk to somebody about the heating system, will speak to a heating engineer, speak to a boiler installer, which is a great credit to the supply chain. But it's a great opportunity, because if we can actually convert that supply chain over, then we have 135,000 people that can go out and actually sell these products. And the flip side of that, one of the heat pump manufacturers we spoke to was bemoaning the fact that manufacturing costs can come down, but at the moment the big cost is the cost to sell. because to go out and individually engage, persuade, convince, demonstrate to individual customers is a huge cost to sell. And if we had that supply chain actually working efficiently, then we'd see those costs come down rapidly.
Yeah, and I think to pick up on that, I think that ties in with the point that I think Liz made earlier about things being rather siloed, is that, you know, at the moment you have 800 businesses in the UK registered to install heat pumps compared to that 135,000 number. And those two groups don't cross over particularly at the moment. So we make a point in the paper about normalising decarbonisation and it being about a discussion with the people that you trust to provide you with information who are already, you know, there's already a very well established industry looking after our buildings and our services and repair and maintenance and construction. And so it's more about, in my view, bringing that decarbonisation into that fold rather than trying to grow this different industry that's at odds with that, because actually there will never be mainstream success if you don't integrate those two. So I think it's providing those longer term signals to the supply chain that actually this is the thing you need to be moving towards. And then we have a great supply chain that can adapt.
I think that's a really interesting positive point, that you know, that there is a very high quality workforce out there, and we perhaps could, you know, think we have to reinvent, and actually there's a lot of skills and expertise to work on, if that's certainly Regen's experience working with that over a long period. I think, Chris, you wanted to come back in on the kind of regional issue, or regional stroke kind of national, and obviously this is something in thinking about your network and how it operates and how you need to invest in it and develop it is a kind of critical issue from your perspective.
Yeah, certainly. So I think, I mean, as mentioned earlier, you know, we have done a lot of work on local area energy planning, and I think, you know, that brings benefits of bringing the community with you. I think what we did when we did that piece of work with the local distribution network operator on electricity was we could take into account sort of the national picture, and it's partly about making sure that we didn't just pass on unintended consequences to someone else to solve. So that particularly the issue of seasonality, it's very easy if you come up with a local plan just to think, well, I'll just get someone else to deal with the seasonality issue and get them to provide my energy in the winter when it's hard for me to do it. And then in the summer, I'll do something completely different. And actually, you know, that potentially could work for a small number, but as that grows bigger, the risk is effectively everybody does the same thing. So wants to sell their energy to the neighbouring county in the summer, then wants to buy it back when it's not available in the winter. So it's those sorts of things. So it is really about getting that both joined up national picture and joining it to the local picture. And clearly, you know, I know Regen are probably at the forefront of that with some of the work you've done on regional future energy scenarios, which then dovetail to national ones. So I think that's a good example of where you can allow really great innovative opportunities based on your sort of local advantages that you've got, if that's a surplus of renewable energy, but combining that with what the national approach is, so you're supporting the national approach and not making it worse.
Excellent. Okay, I should say that people are typing in thoughts and questions that we're seeing coming up here, and I'm trying to integrate those a little bit more now into the discussion. Quite a lot of the points are already kind of coming out from that. We will review through all the comments and points and try and respond to those where you have kind of specific questions that we don't get to today, as well individually afterwards. So we do have a record of all your thoughts. So thank you very much to everyone who's contributing. Some of the themes coming across, urgency is one. Thank you, Fouad, out there in the Tin Valley, for that point about, you know, getting on with this, and hopefully that's a theme that comes across from the paper, that, you know, we really do need to kind of this isn't a theoretical problem to resolve, it's a problem to get on with and address now. Another thing that's come up there is some discussion about bioenergy and the role of bioenergy, and in thinking about this, because that was a big issue for us. Johnny, you know, that's theme that we sort of talked about, and you mentioned in your discussion of the paper, the kind of role, and we'll perhaps come back to Chris in a moment as well, and maybe Liz on that. You know, there's been a lot of reports on bioenergy, a lot of discussion. You mentioned it's a very valuable fuel, but there's also potentially quite a lot of demand, and there's a big question about supply and what is a bioresource, and we start importing it. And I remember back in the day, a lot of discussion about biofuels in cars and how, you know, cutting down palm oil cutting down rainforests to build palm oil plantations, and Range Rovers against food, and there's some really knotty, difficult issues in there. Where did you get to in thinking that?
Well, I mean, we were looking at bioenergy from the perspective of heat, and I think it's clear that bioenergy, but thinking about biomass and woody, dry bioenergy and biomethane, wet bioenergy, that there are opportunities to use it for heat. In fact, biomass, in point of fact, is probably what most of us use for heat at the moment, in the sense that we're burning logs on fires. So it's a very valid heat source.
Somebody lives in the country, too, most of us, I think.
Yeah, I mean, so it is already out there. I mean, there's some very big decisions to be made about how we use land in the future. And we've had the debate about crops versus energy crops versus food crops. And in the past, I guess there was a feeling of, well, you know, clearly we shouldn't convert food crops to energy crops. I think that's changing, actually, and the whole debate about how much meat we're going to eat in the future, which could free up a lot more land space to use as an energy crop. There's also the decarbonisation of agriculture. I think that's what's really interesting, is that farmers themselves have got the opportunity to use farm residues, agricultural residues in their own, and to control their own emissions by using biomethane, AD in particular. There has been a big debate about, well, what size could that be in terms of the overall national energy picture? And I think there was reports out maybe a decade ago that were suggesting that it could be a substantial part of our energy future, maybe 9 or 10%, or maybe even 15%. More recently, I think people have reduced those estimates a little bit, realizing the challenges of converting land, of obtaining feedstocks, and the commercial aspects of feedstocks. But I mean, as Chris pointed out, in the southwest of England, we've got hotspots. We've got areas where there's quite a lot of biomethane production, still relatively low in terms of the overall energy balance. But if we could harness those hotspots and use that energy in a strategic way, locally, potentially to address some of the harder to treat properties or some industrial processes that need thermal heat, potentially in areas like North Gloucestershire, for example, where perhaps there's sufficient there that we, in combination with other technologies such as electrification, we could use that to almost leverage the biomethane and increase the level of decarbonisation. So I think the answer there on bioenergy is that it has widespread use, and it also has a number of potential advantages in terms of land use and agriculture. And we need to think very tactically about how we use it, but it's probably going to be a local solution rather than a national solution.
Excellent. Okay. Liz, you've got to figure out the whole building sector and energy efficiency as one of your tasks, and we talked about that. That was nice and simple. And then there's the whole energy system, gas and electricity and infrastructure. Now, of course, got land use as well. You've also got to work all of that out. Sorry, we're trying to make your life easier, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, no, you're not.
You see that and the links with the work of DEFRA. You talked about joined up governments and some of those kind of big issues about land use and biomass.
So this is something, again, that we're very alive to. One of the things that you didn't mention there actually was bioenergy for BECCS. So if we as a nation need to get to net zero, and we believe or assume that not every single sector is going to be able to get to zero emissions by itself, then some have to go further. And certainly the CCC's net zero report suggested that a really critical use of our bioresources would be in BECCS, so that we can sequester those emissions and have negative emissions coming from that sector to help net off some of the others. So this is huge, because this is, of course, land use, and it's also kind of energy versus kind of national good versus products, because if we're not going to be exploiting fossil fuels anymore, then there's some questions around the future of plastics, which is obviously a material that's incredibly valuable. So these are some really big questions. I think government is aware that what we need to do is join up to tackle them. It's not super straightforward. Not every single one of those areas has a government lead at present, and it's also not clear where such a review needs to be led from, but it's definitely something we're edging towards.
Okay, thank you. You just pretty expert audience, but I should probably pick up on acronyms. Try. I'll probably fail completely, but Beck, I'll let you define.
So BECCS, sorry, is bioenergy, carbon capture and storage. So essentially, I'm not really sure. I assume through gasification. So just taking the carbon from our natural resources and then sequestering it permanently so that we can create negative emissions from that sector of our economy.
I think that's the key point, isn't it? About that is we're talking about negative emissions. We're talking about growing biomass, using it to produce energy, and then capturing the carbon again. So we capture the kind of carbon twice whilst producing the energy.
Yeah.
And that in maybe different technologies and different ways of doing it. And this kind of thought that in a net zero world, or we need zero emissions, we're probably never going to be able to get rid of all carbon emissions, and so we need some way of extracting negative, balancing off any that we do.
The Committee on Climate Change's ambition pathway has 89 million tonnes of emissions offset per year. A lot of that's going to come from land use and sequestration, as we talked about.
Okay, 89 million. Okay, thank you. Chris, we're talking about bioenergy. That's something that has been a big change for the gas networks, and you mentioned famous case now of North Gloucestershire. It probably wasn't famous for today. It's now the country's leading biomethane region. What thoughts about how easy is it for you to take in biomethane? How is that working? Do you have a view of as a sort of network operator that's actually taking this stuff in and taking it to our houses to be used? Do you have a feeling of how well it's working, how easy it is to use at the moment, and indeed kind of how much of the solution do you think it could be?
Yeah, I think clearly, just I think like the electricity networks, early days were challenging around gas quality and communication. But as we've become more professional and the site operators have, it's become business as usual now. So in our forward-looking plan, we do propose some modest investment to actually double that across the southwest of England, particularly, and form a working party in Wales, which is actually quite the opposite of a hotspot. In fact, there's very few plants connected to the gas grid over in Wales for some odd reason. So yeah, it can deliver a lot. It only works in conjunction with other technologies, and I think that's where looking at the whole system, thinking about the waste streams we produce, not just agricultural waste, but Liz was talking about the bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. So there's a plant due to open in Swindon either later this year, early next year, which will actually do that and put a blend of green methane and potentially green hydrogen and negative emissions hydrogen onto the local network, and therefore one of those local solutions. They've got a problem with black bin waste going to landfill, and there's a solution which would actually deliver negative emissions hydrogens to their heating systems. Combine that with hybrids and renewable electricity in that area, and you've decarbonised your heat and your also your transport in that area, because the trucks and buses joining the network, and you've sorted your problem with black bin waste and potentially with plastic waste. So thinking like that from a strategic point of view to start with, and then moving it into a tactical phase is what each of these technologies needs. And I'd stress it again, it's not about one or the other. It's about partnerships and building those together so that we see the best of all of this. The net zero challenge is so big, we can't ignore pretty well any technology that is cost effective in reality mode.
Okay, Chris, one of the questions coming in is, from a gentleman at OVO, in fact, was to give a kind of perspective there, it was about, is hybrids a good solution, a good pragmatic way forward, or is it actually a kind of road to nowhere that's just wasting money investing in infrastructure that then actually that won't have a role in net zero? You guys have been a kind of leader in the hybrid area. I think the question was raised as, do they tempt us into doing something easy rather than what's necessary? Better phrase than I was putting it. So I think you used the phrasing of the question.
Yeah, I suppose the question for me is, does a hybrid lead to a net zero solution, or is it just a temporary fix that then got to undo later? And I think the evidence that was compelling for me was from a project in South Wales, which demonstrated that hybrids could deliver net zero, can deliver zero carbon homes with running around about 80% on renewable electricity and 20% running on green gas. And of course, then with energy efficiency in the home as part of that solution, then you get to actually relatively low amounts of biomethane compared with what we use today. With of course the benefit of the fact that storage, both diurnally and short, medium, long-term storage of a molecule is easier than some of the other forms of storage. So that's where, yes, it can, but I stress it's on a regional basis. But we are just doing a study with looking at how hybrids could affect the use of hydrogen, and we accept that hydrogen is going to be a higher cost than current methane, and therefore how do you minimise that high cost element? And of course, hybrid does exactly that. It takes the best of the renewable electricity opportunities you've got. So the project in Cardiff would perhaps combine tidal lagoon with low volumes of hydrogen and solve the issue of intermittency and storage and seasonality. So I think the evidence now points to a much longer term role for them as opposed to just a transitional folly.
Excellent. Okay, well, that's a really interesting kind of area discussion, I think. Liz, there's a few questions here that probably aimed specifically at you. There's a question about, you said that you published a heat strategy after recess, and maybe inadvertently, I'm sure, didn't say which recess. So that I think you meant summer recess, but let you just make that clear. And there's a specific question about the future of the RHI, whether it will, well, is there a future for the RHI? So maybe you'd like to just try and address those two.
Okay, yes, so apologies, I did mean the summer recess. Obviously, this is not fixed in stone, it's just what we're aiming for at the moment. With regards to the future of the RHI, I'm actually not in a position to say anything right now. So if you could all hang on for another couple of days and watch this space. Okay, excellent. I can't imagine what might be happening in a couple of days. Any guesses from the team? No? Okay. It's me. Great. There's also question about the kind of going back to the question about AD and biomethane and just the cost of gas, and the fact that at the moment it's kind of more economic to burn to use biomethane as to produce electricity than gas, and that kind of economic signals. Johnny, any kind of thoughts on how that's?
Yeah, we're seeing that play out now. Some biomethane being used, CHP plants for effectively peaking plants for electricity, going after rocks or going after peak electricity prices. Other biomethane being injected into the network, and I think, I mean, the biomethane market is kind of being heavily influenced by where the subsidies are. And what we want to see is a biomethane market which is on a much stronger footing based on providing a high valuable product into providing services, whether it's heating services or industrial processes. So I think that market is has great potential, but we're not quite sure yet how that market's going to develop outside of the subsidy regime, which is causing people to do perhaps the wrong things with biomethane. I'm not saying it is the wrong thing to make electricity or put it into the network, but it's not clear yet what the best use of biomethane is.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. We're sort of moving towards the last 10 minutes or so. We're aiming to finish at 12. We haven't yet figured out how long people's stamina is on webinars. So I think the real event we were thinking about 3 hours, so we're trying out 2 hours. Of course, you may all have time to go away and make a coffee and go to Lewin, so you may have plenty of stamina for these things. That'll be interesting to hear your feedback afterwards. So I'm going to come back to Nathan, the National Infrastructure Commission. Can you still hear us, Nathan?
Yep.
Excellent. Just really, we've covered a whole lot of issues there, and this kind of balance of national and regional, techno-economic, and let 1,000-foot, get the dead hand of Whitehall bureaucrats off, and let regions and localities chart the future. You talked about that a little bit in your introductory remarks. You want to kind of any further thoughts, having listened to some of the comments and discussion we've had today?
I mean, I suppose being a Whitehall bureaucrat, I'd hope not to be described as having a dead hand too frequently. But aside from that, I think the discussion for me just underlines the urgency of action being taken to clarify what various solutions are and how they're going to perform in the real world. And I think that one of the challenges in this space is that there's a range of technologies that we just don't understand how they perform technically and how they perform in terms of interaction with consumers in the real world at the moment. So when we think about the kind of, as you framed it, the 1,000 flowers bloom approach of letting a lot of things happen, I mean, there's a huge challenge there of ensuring that it's a local solution that works nationally, which has been talked about a lot. But I think one of the benefits in the near term of that is that we actually start to see some solutions on the ground in action, and we can start to get lots of evidence from that, which will allow us to better chart a path forward, which works for the whole of the UK. I mean, there's so many basic things that we still need to fully understand. So, for example, we're talking about the challenges of electrification and the impact that it might have on sort of significantly increasing peak demand on electricity networks, and therefore there might be a huge cost of upgrading the networks, both in terms of the sort of physical cables, but also building the generation to meet that peak. But a huge uncertainty is, what does the coefficient of performance of heat pumps look like across lots of different temperature differentials in the UK? And we don't really have brilliantly robust evidence on that. Part of that will sort of come from data that's flowing in from smart meters just now, but pulling that together will help us understand, is this peak going to put too much of a burden on the electric system, in which case, how realistic are heat pumps, or is it manageable? And then just to sort of scale that out a little bit wider, when we think about the value of potentially hybrid heat pumps, one of the things that we should be thinking there is, what's the trade-off between having 20% of the heat supplied through some form of decarbonised gas and the costs associated with maintaining a regional and national gas network to supply that versus the cost of having that additional 20% of energy supplied through electricity just for the full heat pump solution, for example. And again, that's back to the, we need to understand what the costs are of maintaining and retaining the gas network, which is quite well understood, but we don't understand the impact on peak again, how the heat pumps will perform, and therefore what that means to that cost trade-off. So I think the thing that I would just be keen to underline is that the more solutions we can see in the near term, the better we can understand how they'll perform. And that means that we can make these more longer term decisions with much more confidence. At the moment, it's very challenging to make those long term decisions because we don't have the evidence, and we just don't have the confidence to make them.
Excellent. Okay. Thank you very much, Nathan. Tim, just kind of coming for a final word from yourself, from all the work that Catapult's done in terms of living labs and engaging people into some of these solutions, and what the kind of local, some of the kind of consumers respond, and the local energy plans. Are we addressing the right things? Are we focusing on the right things in your perspective?
Yes, I think as far as the Energy Systems Catapult is concerned, there's a huge amount of alignment, and I've been picking up on a lot of the things that have been said by Nathan and by Maxine. I mean, one of the things that Maxine said, which I think really tallies with our thinking, is let local areas get on with this, help them, and they do most probably need additional powers. So that's something that Maxine picked up, which I think is really useful. The other thing that I'm not sure if we've talked too much about, it's in your report, it's really great. It's about how you support the consumer, the customer journey for going forward. And one of the ways that we've done work on that, as you mentioned in your report, is through heat as a service. And we believe that that's going to be energy as a service, or heat as a service going forward, is going to be a very important element of changing the way that we buy our energy and electricity and our heat in the home going forward, which actually is much more meaningful to householders, providing comfort, etc., going forward, rather than this very strange kilowatt hour approach that we have at the moment. So there are various things that I think are really important. The consumer journey is something that we think is vitally important. We think there's a lot more work that needs to be done on that. We've been doing quite a lot, as you must already know, within the Energy Systems Catapult. We have a whole team of people focusing on that insight going forward. So, yeah, I think there's a huge amount of alignment with the report you've brought out today, plus some additional things that I think we could be thinking about, particularly around that consumer journey going forward.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Tim. Okay, just Maxine, any final comment or just your quick thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, and I'm really pleased that Tim kind of brought us back to the consumer, because it's always a risk in these conversations, you with the best will wander off. And I think, the work I've just done says what customers are interested in, and it resonates with other ESC work, it's about comfort, cost and control. And I think we've talked about the first two of those. I think the other bit about control is something that, again, we need to just give more thought to. Heat as a service is part of the way of helping with that, but also kind of smart controls and things is one of the ways of making heat sexy. And I think a lot of people have got smart thermostats is a growing bit of the market that's actually being driven by consumers. So, perhaps that's a sign of how we could start to get people interested in and engaged. So comfort, cost and control. Excellent.
Okay. Thank you very much. Liz, any final thoughts for yourself? Anything that, in terms of helping you, and there's over 100 people on this call with enormous amount of expertise. Obviously, we put out our thoughts in the paper. How can people base engage and support you in as you work on that kind of heat strategy over the coming months? What's the best way of them inputting in any particular areas you'd like to get good evidence on? Are you going to be coming out for calls for evidence, or how best can people support you?
So we currently have a program of engagement, and this is being run at quite a number of different levels within the team. So it's not just the drafting team coming out and asking people, but actually on all of our strands of work, on the work we're doing on hydrogen, the work we're doing on electrification, the work we're doing on hybrids, the work we're doing on the consumer proposition. We're trying to connect directly in with people. So I would ask that people keep talking to us, and also, assume that when you're talking to any of us, this is kind of being fed back into the centre. I think also we do have a couple of ways from the slightly more central team that we are reaching out to people. So we're trying to reach out through members, organisations. If you have a burning interest and you think it's not being represented and you think we are missing a trick, then I think my email is probably available through this web chat. So drop me a line, give me a shout, and I will see about getting you plugged in and getting you plugged into the right bit of the organisation. But yeah, this has been really helpful, and I would certainly beg that you keep working with us, because this is not an easy challenge.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Liz. Thank you for the kind offer to share your email. I hope you don't regret that too much.
Me too.
The coming months. Okay, so I think we're coming towards the end. I'll just come back to the Exeter studio for a final comment. Mark, any points you want to particularly highlight from the journey from when you started thinking about this stuff to today?
I think I'm the optimist, like to focus on the positive message that I think is, as I highlighted earlier, I think we, it's not an insurmountable challenge. It's undoubtedly a challenge, as we've all talked about, and as Liz has highlighted. I don't necessarily envy her and the challenge that she has, but I think that there's a lot of knowledge, there's a lot of skills within the broader sector of heat and the built environment that can be captured and used to decarbonise heat and to offer a wide range of benefits as well. So yeah.
Excellent. Okay, Johnny, can you help us in continuing that positive end, finishing on a positive note?
Yeah, I think Morris touched on the opportunity of really capturing that supply chain and the skills that we have and applying that. And I think to date we haven't done that, and so we haven't really seen what we can do in this area. And I pick up on Nathan's point about the uncertainties that we face at the moment. I mean, this next 3 to 5 years is absolutely critical in terms of really understanding the technologies, the solutions, the business models, whether heat as a service is the right way forward, whether heat networks are going to work, etc. So it's a really exciting time, I think, to be confident to test those things out, to challenge ourselves. And then we will have to make some decisions, and those decisions that we do make have got to engage with local people. This is a democratic process, actually, because everyone's heating system is their own, and it's their own homes. I'd also like to mention businesses and industrial processes, which we haven't really talked about today. Let's not forget there's a huge heat requirement in those sectors as well. And businesses, as well as consumers, domestic consumers, need help and support through this journey. So I think this is a really great opportunity. I mean, this is the challenge of decarbonisation, but it's also where we really need to be and provide leadership.
Excellent. Okay. Well, hopefully, Regen come out with a report, and hosting this event is part of that, providing our contribution to leadership. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining. I should finish with a few just a few comments. Firstly, Regen's mission is decarbonising the energy system. That's what we exist to do. So we're looking forward to work with all of you on that. We are a membership organisation, so you can join us via the website or come talk to the team. This is an area that we'll be carrying on thinking about, trying to bring leadership and ideas to it, and it's interesting to see how many people have engaged in the discussion. We've had well over 100 people participating, so we'll be thinking about forums or formats where we could continue some of that discussion, perhaps about heat on a more strategic level. So we'd love to hear your thoughts about what kind of engagement you want, what sort of where you feel the discussions aren't happening. We've been able to bring together a whole lot of different perspectives here today. What sort of ongoing strategy would be helpful there, and ongoing opportunities to engage on these topics. As I said, we'll have a look through all your comments. Thank you very much to everyone who contributed, and see where you've asked specific questions, see where we can respond offline. And perhaps finally to say that this is one of a series, Decade to Make a Difference. We published a report on energy networks for the future back end of last year, which addressed some of those kind of regional energy system, local energy planning type issues and discussions. This is on heat decarbonisation. We're thinking about the role of cities and regions and local authorities more generally, and we're looking to come up with something on that. And of course, we still have the good old power sector, which is we perhaps all think is the easy stuff now, but still quite some big challenges and issues to tackle there. So we'll be also looking at that. If people are interested in working with us and partnering, sponsoring some of those thought leadership papers, then do let us know. So finally, so some really fascinating topics come up. We heard a lot about bringing people with us, democratic, locality-based solutions, not sort of top-down. And I think perhaps that is a key theme for us going forward, is that this is not a scale of change we can impose on people. Maybe that's the case to an extent in electricity, but in heat, it's a very personal thing for companies and businesses, and that's really come across today. We're going to need local solutions. We're going to engage people and get people going, get that marble run going downwards rather than trying to push it uphill, get that marble run going in our favour. So on that note, we shall thank you again, all the participants for coming along, Wales and West in particular for supporting us in writing this paper. Thank you very much, Chris. Thank you very much to Maxine, Liz, Tim and Nathan for speaking, and normally at the end of the event we wish you a safe journey home, but the brilliance of the webinar means we don't need to do that because you're already at home. So we'll just thank you again for participating. Enjoy the rest of your day.